All right, we are live on a bunch of different channels. 770. We have a super special guest with us today, Dr. Ben Scafidi, and he's actually we have a party of Educational Freedom Institute affiliated people today. Matthew Nielsen is the founder or co-founder of Educational Freedom Institute and the president of the board of the Educational Freedom Institute. I'm executive director of the Educational Freedom Institute, and Ben Scafidi is he's a member of the advisory board of the Educational Freedom Institute, in addition to being a professor of economics at Kennesaw State University. Aren't you? And Ben's also the director of the Education and Economics Center over there at Kennesaw State University as well. So super cool stuff. Ben,
and he's a Friedman Fellow at EdChoice.
Yep. So thanks for joining us, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Corey and Matt. Appreciate it. It's an honor.
Ben, you were saying that it was your children's first day back to school today. How's that going?
Yeah, good so far. 2 in college, 2 in high school, and the 2 in college are freshmen. So yeah, it's going fine so far. They didn't do too much. It was more the 2 in high school. Well, the one in middle school, 1 in high school. They're online because their district went fully online. So there were some glitches with the tech, of course, but they got it worked out. And then the 2 in college, one's there face to face and one's living here going online, and so that seemed to go well too. So
good. Yeah, it's a crazy day for kids across the country, right? Because, well, for a lot of kids across the country, for some kids, they thought they were going to school today and they're not, but for a lot of others, they are.
Yeah, so New York Times wrote about a place near you, Matthew, over there in Arizona. What school district was it?
Well, I don't think it was Queen Creek. It was J.O. Combs, right?
Yeah.
J.O. Combs Unified School District. They're the board there out there voted 3-2 in favor to go back to school today. That was the vote by the board, and then they had something like 100 teachers sick out. Right? They called in and said, "We're not going." And so the superintendent called it and said, "Nope, we're not doing it." And that so now, I don't know if you guys have heard this, but there are hundreds of kids outside of, I think, just one of the high schools in that school district today, right now. And the news, local Fox News channel was out there interviewing all of these kids because they're like, "We want to go back to school." And, superintendents out there, all these moms and kids, students, all this stuff. Anyway, it's a crazy day.
Yeah. So. Anyway, let's get to Ben. Ben, give us a little bit of a background on yourself and what you do currently, and then also just your path towards being involved in education in general.
Sure. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, born and raised. And went away to college at Notre Dame, and then came home for my PhD at University of Virginia, and been in Georgia since '98. So it's been a long time. I worked for 2 governors here on education policy. A Democrat, Roy Barnes, I just worked for him on the side, and then I was education advisor to Governor Sonny Perdue, and he's now the agriculture secretary. And those were very rewarding experiences. Enjoyed that. And I'm currently professor of economics at Kennesaw State University, like you said. And I have a joke. Karl Rove and George Bush, when Bush was president, he joked. He said Karl Rove. So George Bush said when he was 9 years old, George Bush would throw the baseball up in the bed and catch it, throw the baseball up, and dream about being Willie Mays when he grew up. And he said Karl Rove used to throw the baseball up in the air, catch it, throw the baseball up in the air, catch it when he was 9 years old in bed. And he dreamed to be special advisor of the president. When I was 9 years old, I would throw the baseball up in the bed, catch it, throw the baseball up in the bed, and catch it. When I was 9, I wanted to be a Friedman Fellow with EdChoice.
Hey!
And on the advisor of Education Freedom Institute.
Well, more importantly, yes, yeah.
Right.
So I kept switching my major in college because I didn't like anything. And when I was a junior, I took economics and just loved it. And so I was taking intermediate microeconomics. And you know how they do budget constraints and indifference curves? And a classic example is, here's the public school system budget constraint, but if we have school vouchers, here's what it is. And the light just went off for me. And I was like, wow, that makes all the sense in the world. And so I guess you could say I've supported school choice since about 1988. There you go. Good job. And I saw a couple of movies, Lean on Me and Stand and Deliver, which are very moving movies about, educators trying to improve the system. And it just made all the sense of the world to me that if we give parents choice, the big thing that we don't talk about is it gives educators choice. It lets them offer their best version of school. And then they hang the shingle and say, our school's like this or our school's like that. And then teachers will sort and educators will sort into schools where they buy into the mission. And that's would be so much better for kids. And I think that's an underappreciated thing about school.
Hey Ben, what do economists call that term when there's one supplier of one producer of a service?
A monopoly.
When it comes to the labor market.
Monopsony. And we'll talk about that actually a little bit later if you'd like. But yeah, monopsony is, so school districts tend to be public school districts. Like in Georgia, most school districts are at the county level, and our counties are big. Mm-hmm. And so they're basically the main and almost predominant buyer of teachers' labor. So they have market power, the school districts, over teachers.
Yep.
So school choice is good for teachers too, says the Honorable Ben Scafidi.
So Ben, we want to start talking a little about you've become at least in my own mind famous for your work on the staffing surge and back to the staffing surge, right? So like one of my favorite things to do on social media, Ben, is to take screenshots of the graphs that are in your report that you produced back to the staffing surge and just use those as replies to people on social media. Like don't say anything, just post this little table, or the bar graph or whatever. It's like, it's really, really a good report. So we want to dig into that a little bit. So if you could just give us an idea, what is your work on, that you've titled Back to the Staffing Surge. Can you give us an overview of what that is? And then we'll dig in a little deeper and how that's relative to today.
Sure. I've written, I guess, 3 reports on this, and that's the latest one, Back to the Staffing Surge. And I've written a bunch of policy briefs, and I've done a lot of one-offs for like state legislators and state free market groups, where I've given them, a deep dive of data for their state. And I enjoy doing that. Where I guess it started was public schools. Like when I was in the governor's office, their advocates always said, we're getting cut. And I mean, I'm a numbers guy and I'm working in the governor's office. Through the data, I'm like, no, you're not getting cut. You're getting bigger increases than everyone else. And so I thought the staffing surge was a very clear way to show that. And this really goes back to like the economics of labor unions. Oftentimes, labor unions have different interests than their members. Like if I was a member of a labor union, I would want more pay, better benefits, cushier job, right? If I was just narrowly self-interested. But the labor union, they want that too because they want their members to be happy, but they also want more members. So this is kind of like the modern feather bedding, as historians call it. The labor union wants just to pack more and more employees in there, and they've been tremendously successful at this, as you well know, Matt. And this has been going on since at least 1950. Since 1950, the number of students in American public schools has basically doubled. The number of staff has increased about 4 times as fast as the increase in students. So we've increased staffing in public schools for 7 decades at a dramatically higher rate than we need to keep up with the enrollment growth of students. And so who are those staff? We've increased teachers about 2.5 times as fast as the increase in staff. But I think people knew that. The public wanted smaller class sizes, teachers wanted smaller class sizes, politicians wanted smaller class sizes. Been there, done that. But what I think people didn't know is that the number of administrators and other support staff increased more than 7 times as fast as the increase in students. And I think that's what people didn't know.
Yep.
And this chart, Ben?
Yeah, there you go.
700%.
Yeah, and it's actually gone up since that time as well. So,
Phew.
So Ben, you chose 1950 on purpose, as you just said, and one of the immediate criticisms comes back from people that want to defend this, the surge anyway, is they'll say, "Well, come on, Ben. Look back to what was required of public school districts in 1950 and what's required of them today." And so you address that in this report, and I don't want to dig too deep on this necessarily right now, because I want to bring it up to our circumstances today. But I think that that's one fair criticism for those who haven't read the report, because you include it in the report. So tell us why 1950? Why is that? Maybe just put a finer point on that, and then you account for some of that, some of the growth, right?
Yeah, I went back to 1950 because that's as far back as I could go. But most of what I talk about in the report, as you know, is I cut it at 1992 to the present, and I call that the modern staffing surge for the reason you just said. I had that concern myself when I was writing my very first report. So I typically was 1992 staffing surge. And so the point is, it's still going on. We're still hiring staff at a higher rate than the increase in students, and we're hiring administrators and other staff at a far higher rate than we're hiring teachers.
Yeah.
So the beat goes on.
Right. Okay, good. So that gets everyone some background on what the report is. I'll just say here, everyone should read this. Like if you're watching this podcast or listening to this podcast later on, after this live stream, you really need to read this report, because if you're interested in what we're talking about generally, you need to get some background on what the staffing surge is, what it looks like, what it's done to education, and so anyway, I'll plug that. So now, Ben, let's talk about how, like you said, it's continued. What does the staffing surge look like in the circumstances of coronavirus?
Okay, the short answer on that one is we don't know yet. At the end of last school year, school districts reported that they had laid off some staff, in March, April. But I think a lot of that was not that they didn't have the money. It's because, number one, they could, because the unemployment insurance, low-income workers got that extra $600. And so a lot of public school staff could get laid off and actually get a raise because of that $600 on top of the normal unemployment insurance you qualify for. What's going to go on this current school year, we don't know yet, because school is just starting in some states and school hasn't even started in most states. So it'll be very fascinating to see what's going on with staffing. I have some theories based on the Great Recession. And if you can show my graph that I had from the Great Recession, from 2008 to 2018, which was the most recent year I could get.
It's his PowerPoint, Corey.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that's okay. So from that's the most recent 10-year period I could get. And notice the Great Recession is in there. So fiscal year 08 is 2007, 2008. And the Great Recession started in December 2007. So notice there was even a modest staffing surge during this time period of a horrible economy for a long part of this period. So the number of students increased 3%, but total staff increased 5%. But look at who those total staff were. Administrators increased 31% in the most recent 10-year period looking at data.
But, oh my goodness.
School districts for 1 second. What they will say is, if you go out yet first, what they will say is it's federal and state mandates are what causing us to hire more administrators. I need to delve more into that. And I think that's a hard question to ask. But
Sure.
My sense, I worked in education policy for a long time, at the state government level. There is something to that.
Then get rid of the regulations.
Yeah. And notice teachers actually fell 1%. So class sizes went up during this time period when we're adding all these administrators, and then support staff, as you can see, went up 10%. So clearly, the public education system altogether, and I call it the 16-layer cake. In a different report I wrote called Georgia 2020, there's 16 layers of government that decide what goes on in my children's public school. The president, the Congress, the US DOE, federal, state, and local courts, governor, state house, state school superintendent, state board of education, our teacher licensing board. We have a accountability office, et cetera, right? There are 16 layers. So you can't really blame any one layer for that staffing surge or that preference for non-teaching staff and administrators. You got to blame the whole thing. Right?
Yeah.
Again, since it's been going on since 1950, and definitely since it's been going on since 1992, you got to say it's not going to change. So I think it's a safe bet. The last 2 years, I don't have data for. The economy was cruising after 2018. So I suspect the staffing surge continued heading right into the coronavirus.
So Ben, this is one where I feel bad, when teachers in particular in district schools start saying, well, we're underpaid, public schools are underfunded. This was the whole Red Fred thing, right? 2 years ago, 2018, late winter, spring 2018, it was a huge deal all across the country. Ground zero, we had Oklahoma, Arizona, West Virginia were kind of like hot spots, right? Where this was going on. And teachers say, my school, public education is underfunded. And you go and you look at these reports, just go to the data, right? I'm not going to argue with you. All I'm going to do is show you the data. Are we underfunding public education in the United States?
All right.
Is that a problem?
There are two things going on with respect to where teachers sit, right? Number one is their unions and their associations constantly tell them, you're getting cut, you're getting underfunded, right? So,
right.
And there's natural trust there, right? You pay them dues, right? And second is their pay actually has been cut slightly, adjusted for inflation. And if you could show my other chart, Corey, if you get a chance, is in the most recent 10 years, 9 years I can only go to 2017. Current spending per student, adjusted for inflation, went up almost 4% in the Great Recession and its wake. And again, since 2017, with the economy booming, it will have gone up even more. So current spending takes out spending on capital, takes out spending on debt service. So this is what you're spending on people and in the school. This is adjusted for inflation and per student. So students in 2017 had about 4% more in real resources per student spent on their education relative to students in 2007, 2008. So there's more money in the system. But as you can see on the graph, average teacher salaries went down, adjusted for inflation, 1.6%. That makes no sense. Where did the money go? One place it went to was higher benefit costs, right?
Yeah,
but another place it went was to the staffing surge. And economists, people call us the dismal science, right? The reason that we're stuck is because we point out uncomfortable trade-offs, uncomfortable opportunity costs. And yes, public schools are getting more and more money over time, in a real sense and on a per student sense, but they're diverting it more to feather bedding, to increasing staff outside the classroom and not putting it into teacher pay. So if you're sitting there as a teacher and you're being told constantly your funding's being cut, that's going to resonate with you because your income isn't quite keeping up with inflation. But what they're missing is the staffing surge. And I'll be honest, when I talk to individual teachers about the staffing surge, they start ticking off names and ticking off positions. They know it. They know this is going on, and a lot of them resent it. And interesting, you brought up Red for Ed. A lot of state legislators in a lot of states had me prepare staffing surge graphs for them during the Red for Ed debates and things. You can't spend money twice. Taxpayers are giving public schools more money over time, but then they're choosing to spend it on more staff.
Yep. So I think that's interesting, and you hinted at this earlier that individual, teachers union bosses have different sets of incentives than individual teachers, and so teachers unions are getting policies that benefit union bosses, but not individual teachers. And like you said, it's because they benefit from having more members, so they can have higher revenues. So they're advocating for more staffing and administrators. And then also, if they have more people in the system, they have a bigger voting block. So they win twice there. Whereas, as you've showed in your graphs, consistently over time, we're pouring more money into the system, but it's not going to individual teacher salaries.
Yeah, I actually have a paper on something you said. We looked at who voted in favor of the 2012 charter school amendment in Georgia. So it was a state constitutional amendment to basically allow charter schools in the state. And what we showed was that for every 1 percentage point increase in the electorate that worked for public schools, it was a decrease in the yes vote by 4 percentage points. So my co-author, Brooke Conaway, used to joke when she would present this paper at conferences. She would say, if you work for the public schools, you convinced yourself, your spouse, and 2 friends to vote no against the charter schools. Having more and more staff allows the labor union to have a bigger budget. But like you said, well said, Corey, it gives them a lot more political power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so could you talk a little bit more about the details about how competition in the labor market could benefit individual teachers? I mean, it kind of makes sense to Matthew and I, but for listeners, could you just go a little bit into, in layman's terms, kind of how that would work out on the ground?
Sure. So a monopoly is when there's one seller of a product, right? And I think most people know what that is, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there's one seller of a product, they can take advantage of consumers, right? They can charge high prices, they can have low product quality, or they can maybe not take risks to make the product better over time, right? Because they're the only seller of that product. Monopsony is the opposite of that, and it's in labor markets. It's when there's one buyer of labor. And so most school districts, it depends on the part of the country, right? In the Northeast, Midwest, school districts are physically smaller, so there's more competition for teachers. But in the South and the West, not in every state, but school districts tend to be geographically large, public school districts. And so they don't have much competition when they hire teachers. So they can take advantage of them. And that's what makes the whole union thing go. They can pay them a low wage. And I wrote some pieces recently for Ed Choice. And I used the term deplorable human resource practices in public schools. In the private sector, the term they've been using for a long time to describe their frontline employees is the talent. They call them the talent. That's a sign of respect. You're the talent, and we're going to treat you that way. In public schools, teachers and other professional educators, they're the talent, right? We treat them the exact opposite. This was about 12, 13 years ago. A big school district in Georgia, I won't say the name, asked me to come help them give professional development to their teachers. And they wanted me to teach about how to do simple research for teachers getting their advanced degrees. And so I did it. They treated the teachers like third graders. They made them sign into each class. And they said, you can't go to the bathroom during classes. We'll give you your professional learning unit credit. And so when the district person left, I said the first thing out of my mouth was, I said, if you're in the bathroom, that's fine with me. I said, if I'm teaching you stuff that you already know and you want to go make a phone call, fine with me. If I'm a bad teacher and you want to leave, fine with me.
You're an adult.
All those teachers were like, and I was like, what? And they're like, no, they're out there walking the halls, making sure we don't leave so we can get, because, the state requires you to get professional learning credits. We're out there counting notices. And I was like, you're treating, these are professionals. The next time a public education advocate says, we need to treat teachers like professionals, I'm like, your system treats them the opposite of professionals. And it is sickening. I'm a college professor. They treat us really well. At least I'm in the business school. I mean, they ask our opinion. They let us make decisions on important things, right? Like curriculum, we decide that, right? We decide different things. We decide our own class schedules. They treat us well, right? It's because they have to, because there's a national market for professors, right? Every once in a while, a school in some far-flung place says, it's not a job offer, but they say, hey, you're interested in coming to this school? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, and then I kind of just let my dean know, so-and-so schools, and just so, but it's because there's competition for my labor. There's not competition for the labor of teachers. And that's why the human resource practices are terrible. And that's why their salaries aren't what they could be.
Yeah, I think even just the monopoly argument applies here too, because when you're in a monopoly, you don't have to spend money wisely. And the best way to spend money wisely is to spend it in the classroom on the teachers. And the current system doesn't have that incentive. Whereas if there's school choice, well, they're going to allocate the dollars to the students in the classroom, which ultimately means, more dollars going to teachers.
They would have that incentive. And if they didn't, parents would all leave the school, educators would leave the school, and the school would close, right? And that would be a good thing, right?
Yeah, I think there's only like 5 studies on this. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but there's not a lot, but there's a few studies that link school choice competition to teacher salaries in public schools, and all of them finds at least some statistically significant positive effects on teacher salaries in the public school system. Yep. So why is the kind of narrative then different than that? What are your thoughts on that, Ben? Because you hear stuff in the news about how school choice is anti-teacher, or how it's it's like a battlefield between teachers and parents. Whereas I think we're kind of in agreement that everybody should be on the same team here, except for the unions, I guess, and the administrators and bureaucrats maybe. But as far as teachers,
what I noticed in Georgia when I was at the state capitol, like there would be like a modest charter school bill when I was there, 15 years ago. And it would be me working for the governor testifying in favor. And then there'd be the one little charter school guy, that had like 2 members at the time, he would testify for it. And there'd be 20, we call them the alphabet soup groups of public school lobbies. There was GAEL, GSBA, GAE, PAGE, there was all these public school lobby groups, and there were 20 of them would testify against us. The public school leaders, their PR machine is the best in world history. They are so good at preserving their monopoly and convincing not only teachers, but convincing the public that they just keep the gravy train going. Just give us more money, keep the system the same, and nobody gets hurt, right? And to be fair, I think a lot of teachers, that's what they know. Right? They went to public schools. They teach in public schools. They might have tenure, right? And so a change is risky, because, and I think most humans are like that, just fear of the unknown. I mean, some people are risk lovers, right? But I think most humans are kind of risk averse, at least mildly.
Yep.
So it's a hard sell. It's a hard sell. A friend of mine said to me 20 years ago, he said, if one state just went whole hog on school choice and had universal school choice, then it would be like, I guess Rick Hess has said this in more recent years. He said it's like East Berlin and West Berlin during communism, right? In East Berlin, they were lied to and said, hey, you have a better life than those people in West Berlin. but they knew the communists were lying because at night they could see the lights. A friend of mine said 20 years ago, because in East Berlin they had rolling blackouts, typically during the day, but often at night because they couldn't afford to, or they had incompetent, energy grid, but also they just didn't have the money to run it all the time. But West Berlin, they had lights 24/7, 365 days a year. So they knew they were lying. But my friend said 20 years ago, if one state went whole hog and then everyone could see the lights and see how much better it is. Now, I know Arizona's moving that way, Florida's moving that way, Indiana's moving that way. That's great. But I testified in Arizona a few years ago, and someone bit my head off at the state legislature. It was a joint House Senate committee meeting. And some school choice advocate bit my head off and said, we have a lot of school choice and we have more than any other state. I said, I agree with you, but you are nowhere near what I would consider to be full school choice. You're moving, I mean, again, this was like 5 years ago, and you passed a lot more since, as you know, Matt, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're still nowhere near close to what I would consider to be a true choice system where parents had full autonomy, educators had full autonomy to
yeah. So what do you envision that to look like, Ben? Could you clarify that full choice system?
Again, I've had this view since 1988, and my views have only strengthened as more evidence has come out and the more I've thought about it. And I've probably thought about it every day since 1988, to be honest. I would take all the money taxpayers spend on public schools. Now, I wouldn't do federal money because I'd be scared of regulations. But I would take all the state local money. I would divvy it up to parents, divvy it up to families, and I would do it in an aggressive way. I would give low-income people a much bigger subsidy than you would give a middle-class person like my family. I would give kids with special needs, their families, a big subsidy, and let them choose the schools they want for their kids. I would let educators choose where they want to teach, and I would let educators decide how they want schools to be and look, and let the chips fall where they may. And that would be a full choice system. And I think it would have ginormous benefits for American students. And I think teachers would get paid more and they'd be treated like the talent.
How would you ensure accountability, Ben? Maybe you already said that.
Well, I wrote this report, Georgia 2020, and I laid out a couple of years ago, and I laid out what my ideal accountability system would be. I'm an economist, right? And so my instinct is to let the consumer hold the provider accountable by them making their decisions, right? Sometimes I buy a product, it's no good, I switch to another provider. Like when the coronavirus was raging in Georgia back in April, May, we were getting our groceries. We would do curbside pickup, and so we weren't going into the grocery store. And this one grocery store we normally go to, the groceries, the vegetables weren't good. So we switched to Whole Foods for home delivery for the groceries. I hated paying the money, but we got really good vegetables. And you know what? We're probably not going to switch, right? The vegetables are really good. And if you watch the sales, boy, you can do a good job, right? But that mechanism doesn't resonate with a lot of people because it's a trust thing. So what I propose in my Georgia 2020 report, if you Google Georgia policy, Scafidi, Georgia 2020, I did it for the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. I said, okay, let's require that every school that accepts students that have a taxpayer-funded scholarship has to offer a norm reference test to kids each year. Pick the 6 big norm reference tests. Let the schools choose among those tests. And you say you have to give this test every year in reading and math to these kids. Thank you. And then the results would be reported only to parents, because parents care more than you and me about whether their child gets a good education. I care deeply that my children get a great education, right? But other people's kids, their parents care more than me, right? I mean, I want their kids to get a good education too, and that's why I work on what I work on. But they care more than me. So require norm reference tests, report it to parents, and then I would have civil society, not the government, chambers of commerce, groups like Education Freedom Institute. I would let them create things like Yelp and grade schools and let parents rate schools. I'm sitting here in my basement. We recently bought a refrigerator for our basement. I did so much research. I went to HomeDepot.com and I looked up all the refrigerators. I called 3 Home Depots near my house and said, tell me what refrigerator you would pick. And it's in our basement where we hang out. So I wanted something quiet. I wanted something that wasn't going to break. And it's like the perfect purchase, right? Word of mouth is a powerful accountability mechanism. So I had employees at the place telling me which ones were brought back because there was some kind of defect or which ones consumers had complained about. They told me which one they had in their house. And then I looked at hundreds and hundreds of comments that people have made about the purchases. And I decided on a Frigidaire.
But Ben, you're not a technician or an engineer. You didn't build the thing. How in the world could you choose it?
Corey's right, Ben. I mean, look, there are a lot of families out there. Think about this. There are a lot of parents that just aren't educated enough to make these decisions for their kids.
Hey, you two are way more correct than you'll ever know. I'm the most non-mechanical person. I said earlier, I kept changing my major in college.
Matthew was kidding, by the way, for the listeners.
That was a joke. That was a joke.
I'll get to that. I know he was being sarcastic. I'll get to that. But so when I went to college, I didn't know anything about anything. And I was good in math, so I majored in engineering. I hated it because I'm not mechanical at all. And so I could do the math problems, but I couldn't understand what was going on in the real world, like with gears and whatever. Every time I tell the story, people start telling me how gears work. I'm like, stop. I don't get it, right?
I still don't care.
The math problem works. So yes, I don't know anything about how a refrigerator works, but I do know what I wanted. I knew I wanted a certain size. I knew I wanted it not to break, and I knew I wanted it to be quiet. And I can read, actually. So I read all these comments, right, on that they have. And I read why people gave it a 1 star. Like the one I bought, a lot of people gave it a 1 star because you gotta bend down to put stuff in it. I'm like, but you're buying a small fridge, it's gonna be low to the ground, but that didn't concern me. So that 1 didn't do anything, And then other people gave it a 1 because the delivery was bad. Well, that's not the Frigidaire's fault, that's the delivery's fault. And then, but most people that buy like a small fridge, they don't care if it's quiet because it's going in their garage, right? So we cared about quiet. So to answer your question, I know what I want. I wrote a paper called More Than Scores on gold scholarship students in Georgia. And lots of people have done this research since that time. We surveyed the low and middle income parents getting tax credit scholarships here in Georgia. And we asked them, what do they want? And what we found was they actually make very good decisions on what they want for their kids. They want their kids to go to college, even though maybe they didn't go to college. They want their kids to be in safe environments. They want smaller settings so that there's more discipline, smaller classes, smaller schools, right? They oftentimes wanted religious values, right? So you can see, we have a million tables in that thing. But, they're very good at making decisions. And public school advocates, not all of them, but many of them privately to me over the years have said things that are so racist and so classist about, they say things like minorities and low-income people can't make good choices for their kids. And, I look at the staffing surge and I'm like, do you think they would choose that? They would just choose you spending more and more money over time, not increasing teacher salaries and just adding more staff. And then what I didn't say earlier is I wouldn't care about the staffing surge. I'm an economist, right? So I look at costs and benefits, right? If the costs were going up, but the benefit had been dramatic, hey, that's great. Right. Mm-hmm. But the research shows that student achievement in America has been pretty stagnant for decades. And so we're spending more and we're getting the same. So that means the productivity of the American education system has gone way down since about 1970, right? Which is ridiculous, because private sector productivity, when it grows 1% a year, when private sector productivity grows 1% a year, people are like wringing their hands like, oh no, the private sector's not up for the job. The public school system, they would kill for 1% increase in productivity per year, because that compounds, right? So we've had a decrease in productivity in the public education system, but in the private sector, productivity has been going up. Again, sometimes not as fast as we would like, but it's still going up, and that compounds.
I mean, are you thinking? I mean, and you can think about it as like class sizes going down as a decrease in productivity per worker. It's fewer graduates with the same or lower academic outcomes per year.
Yeah, exactly.
No other service industry does that.
Exactly, Corey. But if student learning had gone way up, and if graduation rates had gone way up, hey, maybe it's worth it, right? But we haven't seen that. Like public school graduation rates from 1970 to 2000 had a long, slow decline, right? And they've gone up in the No Child Left Behind era, but a lot of people have said it's because they made it easier to graduate. And, oh, we didn't really care about graduation before, like, really, you didn't care if kids graduated before, and so we're still kind of back where we were in 1970, even though spending per student adjusted for inflation has skyrocketed.
Yeah, and similarly, if people are choosing, if they have the choice to opt out of that system that has a staffing shortage, that's a whole different conversation as well, right? Like, if people were satisfied with what that system was producing, either by these outcomes that we're listing or just other types of satisfaction, that would be okay, I think, just if it's freely chosen. But the problem is we're forcing people into the system that appears to be wasting a lot of money. But Ben, I really want to pivot.
Let me make 2 more points real quick about what Matt. And I knew Matt was being sarcastic about poor people can't choose. But public school people will say that privately and mean it. And it's really sad and pathetic. But not all of them, again, but many over the years to me.
Well, and a lot of people who make the arguments for public schools will privately send their own children to private schools.
Yeah, they're actually more likely. Public school employees are more likely to send their kids to private schools than the general population. But years ago, when I was at a previous college, they had the honor students, and they would get together, and some left-wing professor had shown this movie about Walmart being evil. And it was by some labor union funded group called Wake Up Walmart. And so they couldn't find a professor in the liberal arts to be on the pro Walmart side. So they called the business school. I was new with that school.
Go, Ben.
You're going. I'm like, okay, great. So here I am with like 40 honor students, several professors from liberal arts, and then another economics professor, a friend of mine, came too. And so they showed this video that said that Walmart was the devil. And when it was over, I was about to say something. And then my friend grabbed my arm. He's a really good teacher. And he said, let me handle this. I said, okay, Chris, go for it. And Chris Clark said, how many of you, after watching that movie, will no longer shop at Walmart? Not one hand went up. And then
I love it.
He said, how many of you shop at Walmart? And my hand went up, his hand went up, and every student's hand went up. We were in a small town. So Walmart was like a godsend, right? None of the liberal arts faculty raised their hand, which I knew they were not telling the truth, right? Even if you're too dumb to shop at Walmart, the research shows, and this was an economist who wrote this, who was chief economist to President Obama later on. So this is no right-winger. He reported that Walmart, one company, had lowered the cost of living by 3 percentage points for every American, even if you never shop there. So even if you're too dumb to shop at Walmart, you benefit from it.
Because of the supply chain, or like the
what?
Because of the supply chain, or how does it?
Yeah. Give you one example. You guys aren't old enough, but when I was younger, deodorant, men's deodorant, used to be wrapped in cardboard. And it was because it would make it square or rectangular so you could stack it in trucks. And some, assistant VP in Bentonville, Arkansas, had a phone call with all the deodorant companies and said, how much am I paying for that cardboard? And the answer came back between 2 and 3 cents. He said, I'm not paying that. I'm cutting what I pay you 2 or 3, 3 cents per roll on deodorant, and you figure it out. And so what those companies figured out was, instead of stacking it up, they stacked it sideways in the trucks and got rid of the cardboard. So it's saving the environment.
Boom.
Lowered the cost for everyone. So even if you don't shop at Walmart, through and like you said, Corey, the supply chain was a thing. So back to Matt's point, if I'm bad at choosing schools for my kid, I'm going to benefit from a choice system because the bad schools will close because there's not enough of me, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's not enough of me. So if all my neighbors, or not even all of them, if a third of them, if 20% of them are picking schools well, the bad schools close, the good schools will expand, and I just get lucky, right? Yay for me, yay, my kids get a better education, even if I'm terrible at choosing schools. But again, I've surveyed poor people. They do care about their kids, and they want very important things. And Matt, you know that well, and Corey, you know that well.
Yeah, and that reminds me of all the competitive effects studies that EdChoice has summarized in their 1, 2, 3s, like 28 studies, 26 of 28 find positive competitive effects. So you don't even use school choice, and you can benefit from the competitive pressures, even if you stay in the public school system. But that gets me to a chapter that you wrote in a book that's coming out October 7th, co-edited by myself and Neil McCluskey, School Choice Myths, setting the record straight on education freedom. Ben wrote, co-authored one of the chapters with Marty Lucan, who is at EdChoice right now, on one of the biggest myths that exist in the school choice debate. So I think your chapter, Ben, is probably going to be one of the most read chapters, because it's what's heard so often by people who are just discussing school choice, is that somehow school choice siphons away money from public schools and harms public school districts. And could you kind of give us your quick case for
the myth that won't die?
Yeah. Can you destroy that myth for us?
Yeah, and you guys
quickly?
are right. I think the most powerful, it's wrong, it's a wrong argument, but the most powerful argument against education choice is they tell parents it's going to take money from your public schools, right? And when it's a silly argument if you think about it for more than 2 seconds. And I get really angry when economists make that argument, because they clearly they should know better, right? There is no other walk of life that I know of in America where if you patronize one establishment and then next week you decide to choose a different establishment, that initial one gets to keep some of your money in the future, except for public schools. And let me explain. Yep. My kids are in public schools, and we're happy, right? And if we move to a new county and go to a new school district, our current public schools get to keep all local property tax money. They get to keep federal money, pretty much all of it. They just lose the state dollars, which is about 45% of the funding. So they lost a customer. They lost my kids, if we moved, but they get to keep funding for those kids. In higher ed, so I teach at a public university. If a student makes the very dumb decision to transfer from Kennesaw State to Georgia Tech, terrible decision. No, I'm teasing. That's actually very common. I teach introductory economics currently. And so at the end of the semester, I call the students forward that are really good students. And I say, you have the juice to be an economics major. If you don't major in economics, major in something really good like computer science or math or finance or something great, engineering, we have a pre-med, something.
English.
That's actually a rigorous major, actually. But I say major in something good because you got the juice. You're a good student. And almost all of them are transferring to Georgia Tech. But when that happens, when a student leaves, I thought
it was a bad idea, though.
When a student leaves Kennesaw State University one year and goes to Georgia Tech next year, we lose all the funding for that student. We lose their Hope Scholarship here in Georgia. We lose their Pell Grant money. We lose the state formula money. We lose their tuition and fee payments. We lose all of it. And like, if I buy clothes at, clothing store X, and next week I switch to clothing store Y, clothing store X loses all my clothing money, all of it, right? But public schools get to keep, depending on the state,
60% Georgia, right?
Right. And then they complain the loudest that it's losing funding when they lose students. I'm like, they have it the best of anyone. So they have basically no argument. It's normal and reasonable and sensible that when you lose customers, you lose funding. Mm-hmm. Right? That's how the world works, except for them. They have the best funding system that you can imagine. They can lose customers and their funding, 50, 40 to 60% of it stays. Again,
we got to keep the lights on. We got to keep the electricity going. How are we supposed to do that with 40, 60% of the...
Plus there's a social contract, I mean, we're all supposed to be paying in for the betterment of society.
Okay, I'll take Matt's point first. We are doing that for decades. For 100 some years, we've increased funding for public schools on a per student and inflation adjusted basis. So the social contract has been in full force. We're doing that. And we're going to continue to do that just because of politics, right? But to get to Corey's point, I speak a lot for Ed Choice to groups of state legislators. And I tell this story. I say, in Georgia, when you're having a committee hearing on school choice, say the school choice subcommittee in the morning, and you're debating a school choice bill, is you'll have a male superintendent, because women have too much integrity. A male superintendent will come and he'll sound, in Georgia, he'll sound like he's from Georgia. And he'll say, when I lose that kid with that voucher, got to pay that light bill, got to pay that teacher, got to pay that bus driver, got to pay that janitor, right? And so he's basically saying, well, number one, he wouldn't drive to the state capitol and testify against school choice if he thought he'd only lose one kid, right? Right? So he's there to try to stop it. What he's saying is all his costs are fixed. That no matter how many students he has, it's all fixed costs. But then that same afternoon, the same guy, the same local superintendent is testifying to the through 12 appropriations subcommittee hearing. In Georgia, we're a growing state. So he's saying, I'm getting more students. They're coming in, more students every year. Got to hire more teachers. Got to have more classrooms. Got to hire more janitors. Got to have more bus drivers. So in the afternoon, he's hiring he's arguing all his costs are variable. And when I tell this, state legislators are like falling out of the chairs laughing, and they're nodding yes. They're like, that's exactly what they do. So one thing you got to do is tell the truth, right? Is all their costs fixed or all their costs variable? They can't be both. Just logic, right? And I've done some work on this, and I found it varies by state, but about 2/3 of the costs seem to be variable. So when you lose a student, they seem to be able to cut their costs by about 2/3 on a per student basis from one year to the next. But economics 101, accounting 101, in the long run, all costs are variable because you can make new strategic decisions. And so, I would have all the money follow the child, except for federal, again, because I don't want the federal strings attached that would come over time. Mm-hmm. But, they should be like everybody else and have to deal with it. And they'd have, if they lost, 90% of their money per student when they lost a kid, they'd have an more incentive to keep that child in that school. And they would treat them better, and they treat their teachers better because they wouldn't want to lose the good teachers, et cetera. So.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll just point out a good resource for people to check out is the Georgetown University's Edunomics Lab. They have something on the percentage of state and local monies dispersed on the basis of students. And so kind of what Ben was talking about, you can look up your state. So Georgia, for example, it says that only about 40% of the funding is based on students. So you can kind of backdoor calculation, they get to keep a whole bunch of the money even after the children leave to private school through a voucher program or otherwise. Whereas, like Ben said, any other industry, you take your food stamps from Walmart to Trader Joe's, Walmart doesn't get to keep 50-60% of your food stamps. That would be totally ridiculous. And it's similarly ridiculous that we do that with K through 12. And I'm with you, Ben, that 100% of the money should follow the child to wherever they're getting a good education. You think the competitive effect studies are positive now? Wait until you see them with 100% of the funding following the child.
It's the parable of the talents, right? We have these tiny school choice programs where only a tiny amount of the money follows the child, and we're getting modest benefits, right? So you're doing a small thing and you're getting modest benefits. So let's do more of it and get more, right? And then do more of it and get more, right?
Yep. Makes sense. So we are bumping right up against an hour here, and we didn't get through all of our talking points here, Ben. We had some more questions for you. Maybe we can just wrap up with one of them. And in particular, I think it's interesting. It's an interesting question to think about how are state and district coffers looking right now. The reason I asked that one is because you told me before we started that, and it kind of blew my mind. But maybe you can give us some facts and figures on that real quick, Ben.
Sure. State governments had almost $75 billion in reserves before the coronavirus recession hit, which was an all-time high. Good for them. Good for them. They should keep reserves. I didn't compile this next data myself, but I was on a panel with the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee here in Georgia. And he had his staff look, and school districts in Georgia had collectively more free reserves. So they weren't earmarked for anything. They weren't constitutionally obligated for anything. They had more free reserves than the state of Georgia. And the state of Georgia has a good amount of reserves. In the piece I wrote for the Washington Examiner that you just had up, I picked 2 school districts on the East Coast, 2 in the middle of the country, 2 on the West Coast, 1 in the North, 1 in the South in each case. And I picked them randomly. I picked Philadelphia and Miami-Dade. I picked Chicago and Houston. I picked LA and Seattle. And those 6 school districts had about $2 billion in reserves, just those 6 districts. We should use, when there's an emergency, that's what the reserves are for. Hey, we're in an emergency, right? We had the shutdowns and the economy was bad, right? That's the time to break the glass, right? And use reserves, use local reserves. So I am not for a federal bailout at this time. If 2 years from now, we don't have a vaccine, we don't have herd immunity, right? And the federal government deficit isn't gargantuan, then that's an important discussion to have. But right now, no way, right? They should not bail out states and local governments. They shouldn't bail out school districts right now because they should use state and local reserves first. And if states and districts don't have reserves, that's your own fault. Because we just had the Great Recession, 12 years ago. We knew recessions come. You got to plan for reserves.
Well, in those 6 districts, $2 billion. I mean, that's 6. Now they're big, right? I mean, those are big school districts, but $2 billion is a big number too.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. And I wanted to have you say that because that'd be relative to the article you wrote in the Examiner. That's good info to have to match those up and say, should they really be getting more money? Because they already got $2 billion.
It seems like they could save a lot of money too with a lot of the plans to not reopen in person. They could save a lot of those fixed costs.
Yeah, I think there's some, but there's technology costs and there's they're doing a good job, like in our neck of the woods, of transporting the food to kids who are and so I don't think those savings are as big as some people think, but on net, but they have reserves. And if the feds bail out school districts, we're just going to have another staffing surge. We know that from history.
Yep.
So you're not coming out in favor of the $70 billion proposal from the Republicans, or what's the one from the Democrats, 200 billion or something, some higher number?
Much higher number. It's in my Washington Examiner piece. I forget what it was, but.
Well, we appreciate.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of any of them now.
Triple 1 and 3x, whatever they are.
In addition to the 13.3 billion or 2 billion that we've already allocated through the CARES Act and hasn't really been spent by the states. But yeah, I mean, this is all good stuff, Ben. We're super happy that you took an hour of your time to discuss these numbers with all of our viewers, and everybody was super excited to have you on because we always cite your staffing surge research. So it was overdue to have you on the show, and we'll have to have you back soon.
Anytime, Corey and Matt, and my honor to be with you. You guys are great. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. This was another week and episode of the Educational Freedom Institute podcast. And our special guest today, as a reminder, was Dr. Ben Scafidi, a professor of economics at the Kennesaw State University.